to session 2 of this series, which is called Our Faith in Context. Before we begin our survey of Hinduism, which is the religion we're going to talk about today, I want to spend a few minutes going over last week's key points for some of you that perhaps weren't here, or I went too fast, or there was too much to absorb, or whatever. So, last week we talked about the title of the series, Our Faith in Context, and the meaning particularly of context, the circumstances or facts that surround a particular situation. Context in this case is that all of us are surrounded by people who believe in other religions. Our lives are interwoven with theirs. So it seems to me like it behooves us to understand as much about those religions as we can. Then I gave you a long definition of religion that has some key words in it. Religion, first of all, is a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe. This goes right back to what Steve was talking about this morning. Religion, especially when considered as the creation of a superhuman agency or agencies, usually involving devotional and ritual observances, and often having a moral code for the conduct of human affairs. 5 major religions that we're going to talk about, beginning with today, are Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And then we pose the 7 questions that all people ask. Who or what is God? I told Steve after his sermon that those are the questions that we are going to consider, the ones that he posed this morning. Who am I, and how do I operate in my world? How can I tell right from wrong? When it's all over, where do I go? How can I know the truth? What does my life mean? And how do I fit into history? In order to see how each religion answers those questions, we're going to spend 1 week on a survey of each religion, which deals with history and geography, size and importance, sacred texts, sacred spaces, temples and holy places, worship, sacraments, and festivals, and the influence of the culture. In the second week, we're going to talk about beliefs, identity, attributes, and powers of the god or goddess, the relationship between God and humans, death and afterlife, ethics, and goals. And for each religion, we will follow the very same format. Okay, now, I asked you last week if anybody had any questions. You could write them down and then I would do some research to try to answer them. I had 2 questions. The first one was, would I provide a handout of the major points? Well, I decided not to because they're going to be on the screen. Even if you're taking notes, they'll be on the screen, and I would rather spend my time trying to find the answers to questions and trying to work on my lectures than typing, which is one of my least favorite jobs. Second question was, do any of the religions accept homosexual practice? I went back and looked at them all. Now, this is not exhaustive because I did not look at all the texts, the major texts from each religion. But I looked at my notes, and let me just go through what I found. In the Hindu religion, the god Shiva has control over sexuality. But the goal is for people to marry. They have strong ethics, and in their ethics it says, do not overindulge, either in sex or gluttony. So it's a kind of a wide-ranging prohibition. The Jains, which is an offshoot of Hinduism, calls for sexual restraint. Buddhism has an 8-fold path. going to talk about this in a couple of weeks, but the Eightfold Path, one of the things in the Eightfold Path is right conduct, which says no lustful activities. And even in Tantric Buddhism, which celebrates sex when joined with love, that's heterosexual sex. Judaism. Well, Noah was given 7 universal laws to avoid forbidden sexual relationships. And of course, in the 10 Commandments, it says, do not commit adultery. Christianity. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, talked about going beyond the 10 Commandments and said, don't lust in your heart. And Paul, in 1 Corinthians 6:9, and I'm going to read this one because this is the most explicit statement that I could find anyplace. This is what Paul says to the Corinthians. Do you not know that the wicked will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor male prostitutes, nor homosexuals will inherit the kingdom of God. A pretty strong statement. Islam. As you will see when we get to Islam, one of the interesting things about Islam is that it presupposes that men cannot control their sexual appetites, which is one of the reasons that women are veiled. And it is also one of the reasons that during prayers, when Muslims prostrate themselves, the women have to be behind the men rather than in front of the men. I could not find any direct statements about homosexuality. Okay, now, since we are Christians, let's go back to that challenge by Paul in Romans 12:2. Here's what Paul says. I talked about this last week. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So, let's begin with prayer. Heavenly Father, we come to you with lots of questions, with lots of things that we don't know, and we ask you to make them clear to us. Help me to be humble and admit the things that I don't know. Help us all to be receptive to what you would have us understand. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, we begin our survey with history and geography. And the history of Hinduism is very interesting. So let's look at the map from, there's a map from 1909. This is kind of interesting because it's 1909, okay? In 1909, the Brits were firmly in control of India. It was a colony. And that sort of pink color indicates the Hindus that lived in India in 1909. Mostly was Hindu. Okay, the story then begins in India. In fact, the word Hindu at first meant the country, not the religion. The word used by natives for the religion was Sanatana Dharma, meaning eternal religion. The Persians named this religion Hinduism in the 12th century, and the name then began to be adopted by everybody. We have to go way back in history now, between 3000 to 1500 BC. This is before Abraham, starting in 3000, okay? There was an ancient Indus Valley civilization in the north, which is now Pakistan. Okay, just so you have some feel for this. That civilization, which we only know through archaeology, practiced fertility rituals and ritual purity. One historian that I read said that there were more baths for ritual purity in this area that they have discovered than even the Romans had, which is rather remarkable. Okay, this civilization died out. Nobody knows why. Okay, about 1500 BC, the Aryans invaded or came in peacefully. The historians can't agree which, whether it was a warlike invasion or not. But in any case, the Aryans came in from the north. They had a more advanced civilization. They had horses, they had chariots, they had bronze. And, excuse me, they were nomads. They brought different gods, and they brought Sanskrit, which was a different language. Sanskrit is related to present-day European languages. Okay, so then about 800 BC, there was a re-evaluation of religious beliefs, leading to the rise of what is called classical Hinduism. People began to examine the possibility of an afterlife. Two new features of classical Hinduism were the concepts of transmigration of the soul, or reincarnation. And I think we have a slide for that. Reincarnation is the belief that human souls are reborn into another physical form after they die. Another physical form after they die. Okay, that's important. Now, this could be a different form. It could be human. It could be animal. It could be insect. It could be demon. The form is determined by one's karma. Karma is action and its consequences. How you are reborn into the next life is determined by how you live your life now. One scholar says, every person gets what he deserves. Karma is a principle of absolute justice that acts impersonally like gravity. Okay, so two terms. Keep those in mind because they are important as we look at Hinduism. Reincarnation or transmigration of the soul, same thing, and karma. Okay, so between 711 and 715 AD, the first Muslim invasions happened in northwest India. There, of course, was a big contrast between the existing Hindu religion and this Muslim religion that came in with these invasions. First thing was polytheism. Hindus had many gods and goddesses versus monotheism. Islam has only one God. The use of idols and images. You saw the depictions of the many images and gods and goddesses and so forth. Versus with Islam, which considers idolatry as the greatest sin. Okay, the Muslims, during the time that they were in control of India, which was a long time, almost 1,000 years, destroyed many temples and images. During that time, Hindus who did not convert to Islam were tolerated. They had a choice. They could convert to Islam. They could not convert and pay a heavy tax, or they could undergo the sword. Well, they had three choices. And many of them chose to pay the tax and stayed with their religion. The influence of the Muslims in India got stronger and stronger, and in 1192, which was about the time of the Crusades, just to give you something to hang that on. A Muslim capital was established at Delhi. Okay, in northern India, there was a series of Muslim emperors, beginning with Akbar the Great in 1556. Okay, now this is about the time of Shakespeare. Okay, so in about that time, Akbar the Great became the emperor. He was a Muslim, but he was a tolerant Muslim, and he encouraged the civilization, and that is considered kind of the golden age of Hinduism in India. Those rulers were called the Mughals, and they were tolerant, and the culture thrived. Not until the 1540s was there the first Christian mission in India. So you can see that Christianity did not have an influence for a very long time. Okay, then, now historically, we move on to 1818, and the British began moving into India. First, it was trade with the East India Trading Company. You've heard of that. And then, of course, trading was so lucrative that they expanded. They took over more control. And finally, in 1857, they defeated the Muslims. 1857. The Brits defeated the Muslims. India became a British colony. And it was a British colony for the next 90 years, until 1947, when it became independent. The map that you're going to look at again in a minute shows what happened in 1947. India got its independence, but also it was divided, or partitioned is the word. Some of you may remember this 1947 huge uproar, because there was this big fight between the Muslims, who wanted their own territory to control, and the Hindus that wanted their own territory to control. So the country was partitioned, and the northern portion became Pakistan, and the southern portion stayed India. So the northern portion was in control of the Muslims. The southern portion was relatively in control of the Hindus. There was also that part called East Pakistan. You see it on the map there. That is now called Bangladesh. Okay, but that is also Muslim. Now, this did not happen easily. In fact, my sources tell me that 14 million Hindus and Muslims exchanged countries. 14 million. And there were clashes. There was essentially civil war. 600,000 people were killed. Okay. This might help you understand some of the long simmering bad feelings between these peoples. Okay. Also, when I was doing this study, it reminded me that if you are a reader, there is a wonderful series of novels that was written in the 1960s by Paul Scott, an Englishman, and it's called the Raj Quartet. India was called the Raj by the Brits. The first novel is called The Jewel in the Crown, and it's set in 1942, and it shows you the conflicts that are going on in 1942 between the indigenous people of India and the Brits. And it's quite fascinating. Long, small print, but good. So if you want to look at that. Also, if you want to look at the archives, this was also made into a television series sometime in the late 1960s. And you might want to look at that. I've never seen the television series, but I have read the book. Okay. Now, we go next to size and importance. Why is Hinduism considered one of the great religions of the world? Well, first of all, it is the third largest religion in the world behind Christianity and Islam. 95% of Hindus live in India, mostly in southern India. India's government is officially secular, but 80 to 85% of the 1 billion people living in India are Hindu. One of the reasons that Hinduism is one of the large religions of the world is simply the fact that India has so many people living in it. Okay. However, there are 15 million Hindus who live in Pakistan and Bangladesh, which is ostensibly under Muslim control. In Nepal, Hinduism is state religion. There are 2 million Hindus that live in the United States and Europe. In India, 10% of the population are Muslims. So you can see that during partition, not all the Muslims moved to the north, not all the Hindus moved to the south. So there are some remaining people in those countries. 2% of the population of India is Christian, not very many. 3 to 4 million are Buddhists. 2% are Sikhs, mostly who live in what used to be called the Punjab, up in northern India. They're the ones that have those wonderful turbans, and I'm going to talk more about them. Okay, and 2 million are Jains, and both the Sikhs and the Jains are offshoots of Hinduism. Okay, I'll talk about those next week. Okay, now we turn next to sacred texts. We're always going to look at what texts are important to a particular religion. So, for the Hindus, there are 3 major ones. The oldest one is called the Veda, which means knowledge. The Veda, it's not a book like our Bible. It's hymns, chants, praises to the gods, plus a guidebook for rituals and priestly behavior. It also has magic and charms for blessings and curses. Now, the Veda was first transmitted only orally. It was not written down. And the priests had to memorize it exactly. In order to do that, they memorized it forward and backward. And then they memorized it again, skipping every other word, which I couldn't do. The idea was that it be transmitted exactly. This was the way that they did that. One of the key statements in the Veda is this: God is one. Men call him by various names. And that's an interesting thing to think about with Hinduism, which has many gods. Okay, so the Veda, we're still talking about the Veda. It was divided into 4 collections, each one different, dealing with a different aspect of ritual. The oldest and most important is called the Rig Veda, which means praise. It was composed between 2300 and 1200 BC. It contains more than 1,000 songs to various gods and goddesses. It also contains mantras, or sacred words, that are used during rituals. Interestingly, the Veda had several totally different creation stories. But this didn't seem to bother anybody. Okay? The Veda, this is a quote from one of my sources, the Veda regarded humans as being individual souls and members of a stratified society. For the Aryans, remember the Aryans who came in from the north, the essence of human life is the soul, which they associate with the breath, designated by the word Atman. Our English word atmosphere is related to this Atman, or breath. Because the breath leaves the body when a person dies, Aryans believe that the breath is what enlivens the body. The Vedas were written down only after the Muslims arrived in 712 AD. Up until then, it had been orally transmitted. Okay, the second one that we want to look at is the Upanishads. And Upanishad means sitting near. Okay, now the reason for that is like a disciple sits near the master or the guru. This is a dialogue between students and teacher. So, the concept here, now we come to these concepts that I was talking about. Karma, which is one's deeds in this life affect the next life. Okay? You get what you deserve, right? Second concept is samsara, which is reincarnation. And the third concept is moksha, which means relief from the cycle of reincarnation. Okay. The Hindus kind of think of life as a wheel. You know, it goes around, you have a life here, you die, you're reincarnated in another life, it goes around. All right, so if you achieve moksha, you get off the wheel, right? And you are not reincarnated. Okay, the Upanishads began to question the emphasis in the previous life that was on prosperity, in other words, getting rich and having lots of children. Began to think about the soul. Began to show anxiety about death and the need for immortality, and asked, what is the structure of reality behind appearance? Brahman was that which makes great. Brahman was the ultimate reality. And to discover oneself is to find God. Also, if there is no clinging to life, there will be no rebirth. So the idea is you don't cling to life, you may not be reborn into some other existence. The purpose of the Upanishads is to help you discriminate between experiences that have only passing value and the living knowledge of the divine being, which is the supreme and everlasting value. The third of the texts that we want to consider, and this may be one that some of you have read in a college course, because this is one that seems to be more accessible to Westerners, and it's called the Bhagavad Gita. Sometimes it's called the Gita for short. And that translates as the Song of the Blessed One. This was composed later, between about 200 BC and 100 AD. So, more into the time that we're thinking of as the time of Jesus Christ, for example. Okay. This is a dialogue between the god Krishna and the human Arjuna. Arjuna is confused about what to do. What's the right course of action? And the whole idea is that one may reach God through devotion, knowledge, or selfless action. Devotion, knowledge, or selfless action. Sounds like a plan. Krishna says to Arjuna, well, everybody dies, so why not die fighting for justice? Death is when the soul changes its clothes. The inner self never dies. But Arjuna is overwhelmed, and he wants to see what God looks like. But Krishna says this to him: "Now surrender to me. Worship me in all your words and thoughts, and offer your actions to me as a sacrifice of love. You cannot even begin to conceive about how much I care for you. I am your eternal refuge. Don't be afraid. I promise I will save you." Good words. The whole idea in the Gita is that the battlefield is not on the field, it's in the human heart. Okay, so 3 major texts, very ancient, up to only 2,000 years ago. Okay. Next we come to sacred spaces, temples, and holy places. Now, Hindus consider India itself to be a holy place, Mother India. There are also 7 sacred rivers, of which most of us know about the Ganges River, because if you bathe in the Ganges, that's good karma, okay? And that will help you maybe not to be reborn in the next life. In addition, there are some very famous temples. And if we look at the temples, one of the things that is typical of a Hindu temple, this is a good example, is that the outside is covered with figurines, covered with statues of various kinds. Okay, now, this particular one is Angkor Wat in Cambodia. It's one of the most famous ones. This particular temple is to the god Vishnu. And we can look at another one, which is this is another view. You see how big that one is. Okay, this one is Benares temple. And a third one, which I'm not sure I can pronounce this name. You want to try that? Venkateswara, okay, which has 10,000 steps leading up to it. And the idea is that those 10,000 steps indicate the spiritual pilgrimage that people are on. Okay, now, lots of images on the outside. The inside, I am told, of those temples is relatively bare, empty. Okay, but it has the image in it of the god or goddess to whom this temple is dedicated. And the image is treated as though it is human. It is bathed, it is clothed, it is decorated with flowers and jewels and other things. It is fanned to keep it cool. It is offered food and incense. But when the designated time for the god to inhabit that image is up, I don't know how long that time is, but when it's up, the physical image is destroyed, either by burning or by plunging it into water. The idea is that while the god may incarnate the image is not the god. So it's a kind of a temporary thing. Okay. The many gods and goddesses serve to overwhelm the human mind, reminding us of the unspeakable nature of ultimate reality. By worshiping an image, one can gain access to the deity. One quote says, "Most Hindus think of the sacred image as the actual incarnation of the Supreme Being, a form taken by the Godhead in order to receive worship." At the temple, if one goes to the temple, one takes off one's shoes, dresses modestly. This apparently is a problem for Westerners who tend not to dress modestly in hot climates. You wear no leather. And you walk around the temple several times, first with the temple on your right before entering the temple. You do this. You bring gifts, flowers, fruit, money. You bow and touch the step with your fingers of your right hand. Then you touch your forehead and your heart. You touch your feet. While in the temple, you get your forehead marked as a blessing. This is interesting because Hindus do not have, like we do, corporate worship. In other words, everybody comes together to worship corporately. By and large, it is an individual kind of worship. Okay. The fourth place of worship is the home. And one of the things that's interesting about worshiping in the home is that the authorities say that this is what saved Hinduism during the time that the Muslims were destroying temples, because people still had their shrines in their homes and kept the religion alive. So there is a shrine to a personal god, and morning, noon, and evening there are simple sacrifices, usually with the father as priest, utters the god's name, recites mantras, hymns, and praises. Often there is a candle burning. Some of you may have noticed about a week or two ago, there was an article in the local newspaper that there had been a fire in an apartment building, and the conclusion was that the fire was started because of a candle burning at a Hindu shrine within the home. Okay, so this is alive and well in San Jose. Now we come to kind of an offshoot of this: worship, sacraments, festivals. All of my sources tell me that to Hindus, ritual, that is what you do, is more important than doctrine. Okay, this is not true of Christianity, typically. Doctrine, what we believe, is important. Okay, it is, as I mentioned before, individual worship rather than corporate worship. Some of the ways of worship include reciting a Gayatri mantra, which is a string of words, and they keep track of it with a rosary, something like a rosary, 108 beads, each of which has a separate word. This is an aid to meditation. I talked about worship in the temple. Sometimes Hindus make pilgrimages to temples for spiritual purposes, spiritual renewal, for dharma. It is a way of increasing your dharma. There are also special holy days for major events in life. Most religions have these. Birth, the first haircut for a boy. Girls don't count. There is also, this is a kind of rite of passage into adulthood for boys. Sometime between the years 9 and 15, there is this sacred thread ceremony where a literal thread is wound around the boy and illustrates the continuity between life and death. One of the festivals that, in fact, you may know is Diwali, because it is celebrated often and locally. That is the festival of lights. And people light lamps, they float them down the river, and I want to tell you the origin of this particular festival because it's very interesting. A poor fisherman found a priceless necklace in the stomach of a fish. Okay? It was the queen's favorite jewel, which she had lost while bathing in the river. The fishwife told her husband to take the necklace to the palace, right? Return it to the queen. But, she said, refuse any reward. When the king insists, ask that on a certain day in October, No house but ours is allowed to show light. Well, this was granted, and when the goddess Lakshmi, and I'll talk about Lakshmi next week, came looking for a place to stay, guess what? There was only one lighted house, and she came and stayed with these people. So since then, people light and decorate their homes, put lights everywhere to attract Lakshmi. It's a nice story. Okay. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the influence of the culture. And this is, I think, particularly important with Hinduism, because India has many subcultures. I did not know this, but India has 325 different languages. 325. Many mixed racial stocks. If you see your neighbors, you will notice that some of them are very dark, some of them are a little dark, and some of them look as pale as you and I look. So, many mixed racial stocks. This is partly due to their cultural history, and I put this up here for those of you who are taking notes, brave souls, and for us to kind of renew what's happened. Okay, so we had the Aryan invasions early on, people from the north. We had the Muslims invasion for 1,000 years from the south, because they came from Arabia. Well, south and east. Okay. My geography is not terribly good. Then the British defeated the Muslims and ruled for 90 years. And then there was partition and independence from 1947 until now. So, they're not the only peoples that have had this kind of history of invasion and new cultures and so on. But it does have an impact on their religion. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about, which is a mix of social, political, and religion. And that is the one thing, I guess, that I knew something about in India before, and that is the caste system. You may think that the caste system has disappeared, but it has not. It still exists today. That hymn from the Veda says that the reason that there is a caste system is because it comes from the head, the arms, the thighs, and the feet of Brahma, who is the creator God. Now think about that. Head, arms, thighs, feet. Okay, now, the assumption is that people have different capabilities and thus should have different occupations. Okay. Caste, however, is destiny, and it determines such things as whom you can marry. It determines what and with whom you can eat. It determines people with whom you socialize. So here's the caste system. We have the Brahmins, who are priests and teachers. I don't think they're teachers like me. They're religious teachers, okay? Well, guess where they came from? The head, right? Then we have kings, warriors, and politicians. The arms. Okay? And then you have merchants, businessmen, and farmers, the thighs. And then you have peasants, laborers, and servants, the feet. of the Creator God, Brahma. There are also no caste or outcast, what Mahatma Gandhi called the oppressed ones. They don't even figure in this because they are out of the picture. Okay? The British actually outlawed outcasts in 1947, just before partition, but it didn't take, and it's still practiced. My sources tell me that as of this day, 15% of the Indian population are outcasts. And they get all the dirty jobs. Okay? Guess who gets to conduct the cremations? Guess who takes care of the dead bodies? Guess who cleans the toilets and things like that? They function in society, but they have no rights, and it's a pretty bad situation to be in. Who you are is a consequence of your actions. So it's fair and just. The next life will be better. Okay, caste is actually not a Hindu word. It is a Portuguese term used to describe the stratification of Hindu society based on occupation and purity. Once, early on, it was simply a division of labor. Then it became deeply embedded in the social and religious life. And this was spelled out in a document called the Laws of Manu, which was written about 30 AD. This is the time of Jesus, 30 AD. And it says that the caste system is based on the assumption that all people are not created equal. This is hard for me, okay? They are born with innate differences derived from how they acted in previous lives. The Dharma, that is the sacred duty of each caste, carries specific duties and responsibilities. So, the Brahmins' responsibilities are teaching, studying, sacrificing for himself and others, making and receiving gifts. The duties of kings, warriors, and politicians are to protect the whole system from foreign enemies and keep the caste system to maintain social and cosmic order. Merchants, businessmen, farmers are to take a wife, keep cattle, sow seed, know weights and measures, and the worth of materials. Okay? Peasants, laborers, and servants are to serve the other castes with humility. And no castes do not have their own sacred duty because they're outside the system. Okay. Hindus believe that a breach of caste can cause social chaos and destruction. Wow. Right? Okay. This concludes our survey of Hinduism. Next week, we're going to talk about gods and goddesses, life after death, and so on and so forth. But this gives you a kind of a broad overview. Why don't we close in prayer? Gracious Lord, this is a lot to absorb. We have many questions about this faith. We look at our own faith. In some ways it seems simpler. It certainly is different. But we ask you to keep our minds open, keep us cognizant of the fact that many of our neighbors practice this faith. Be with us during the next week.